Okay, we're about to start Sefer Yeshua, Parak Aleph, Pasuk Yudalid. I don't want to be makdim. I do want to just say that this pasuk is probably going to be broken up into 2, 3, maybe even 4 different shurim. There's a lot here. The Iker, I want to focus on many dinei Milchama, the dinim that Yeshua had, the dinim of the Milchama, the dinim of Kibush Eretz Yisrael, and we did discuss a lot of this in the past, and we will, in Mitzvah, be discussing it in future shurim as well. But for the time being, for right now, I want to leave it at this, and we'll take it from here. The pasuk state. Just want to focus on the beginning part of the pasuk, a couple of hours. The pasuk state: Nשיכם, טפכם ומקניכם ישבו בארץ אשר נתן לכם משה בעבר הירדן. Your wives and your children and your animals are going to settle in the land that Moshe gave you in Ever Yarden. Ve'atem tavru chamushim, and you're going to cross over the Yarden armed. Chamushim means with weapons. Lefnei achechem, in front of your brothers, meaning that you're going to stand in the front lines. Koil giborei hachayil, all the strong warriors are zarta moisam, and you're going to help them out. It's just interesting. L'shaynus over here, this chamushim, and this giborei hachayil, and what's va'azarta moisam? You're going to help them. It sounds like you're going to help them. You're not going to fight. You're going to help them. You're going to change a flat tire. You don't need to have chamushim to change a flat tire. And what's kol giborei hachayil? As opposed to what? So Rashi says that kol giborei hachayil is kol giborei hachayil shabachem yabru chalutzim. All the giborei hachayil from these shvatim should cross over chalutzim with their weapons. This chalutz itself, this giborim. What's the difference between these lashonos? We discussed that already. We're Ayman at the Sa'ara already. Okay, that's Ha'ara number 1. And Chamushim is Muzuyanim, like Rashi says in Parshas B'Shalach. We'll get to that as well. Neshechem, Tabchem, the Radak says it's missing a Vav HaShimush. K'mei Shemesh, Yoreach, Ruvain, Shimon, Ruvain, V'Shimon, V'Adaim Lahem. Chamushim, he says, is K'mei Chalutzim, ready for war with the weapons, ready to fight. So that's the story. So we discussed already the concepts of Bnei Gad and Ruvain, how they were Zeicha to their Chelek and Nachla in Ever Yarden. So the Malbim says, V'lo k'neshei achechem, they're not going to be moving around like the wives of your brothers, meaning of the other Shvatim. L'chein min hayosher, therefore it's the right thing to do. Ki atam tavu chamushim l'fnei achechem, that when you're going to cross over the Yarden together with the rest of Klal Yisrael, you're going to go with your weapons. That's why it's l'fnei achechem. L'fnei achechem sounds like because they're giborei hachayil, that's why they have to stand on the front lines. This is an understanding that the Milchama will be a Milchama b'teva. And that's why the pasuk says that the giborei hachayil have to cross over. Masha'in came. If this war is going to be a war l'fnei Hashem, a Milchama that's going to be fought with miracles, and it's not going to be fought in any physical way at all, so then the whole nation could cross over together. It doesn't matter. You don't need to have specific people to fight in order to have it that they should win the war, because it's being fought by Kodesh Baruch Hu, it's not being fought by the Teva B'chlal. But we know from the stories of Eliyahu and Elisha that you need to have something with a Neis K'Bichala, meaning that we have to do some kind of a shtadlus, and then Kodesh Baruch Hu takes it from there and does what he needs to do over there. And it's mashra from the pasuk that Yeshua was asking them to please leave their wives over in the Eretz Hazois, right? As we'll see what this whole business was, as we spoke previously, but I want to get into it a little bit more. Now, there's a big shaila over here that in this pasuk it mentions the Noshim first, the Tafchem second, and Meknechem third. Neshechem, Tafchem, Umeknechem. Now we know that Moshe Rabbeinu gave Eichocha to Bnei Gad and Ruvain because they were makdim the Mikneh. When they were talking to Moshe, they mentioned the animals before the children, and they didn't mention the wives at all. But we find by Yaakov Avinu, there's a lot of different places in Tanakh that we find different orders of things, and l'chayr there's a makom yun, because why is there a taina of Bnei Gad and Ruvain if elsewhere we find that there were other people that did it that mentioned, the children first, or the wives first, or the mikna first. When do you have to be makbid on the seder? When do you not have to be makbid on the seder? So that's what I want to focus on, be'ikr. So the reason why it says it in this order of nשיכם, טפכם, ומקניכם, at first we mentioned the women, the wives, then the children, then the mikna. That's the seder that Moshe Rabbeinu used in Parshas Dvarim, in Paragimel Pasuk Yutes. Rak nשיכם וטפכם ומקניכם ידעתי כי מקנה רב לכם ישבו בעריכם שנשאתי לכם. That's a direct quote from what Moshe Rabbeinu said. So then we have to know, why is it that in Parshas Matas, in Pasuk, in Parak Lamed Beis, Pasuk Chavav, it says Tapenu Neshenu Miknenu, mention the Taf first, and then we mention the Noshim. So you have to say that when they were talking about a specific inyan for the children, because they wanted to bring out a point about the children, so then you would mention the Taf first. If you want to mention, if you're talking in general, then you would have to mention the women first. Because they wanted, when they were responding to Moshe Rabbeinu, that they spoke about the Mikna first. Meaning, what's the problem if they spoke about the Mikna first? So Rashi says, and we'll get to this Rashi later in a couple of minutes also, that the concept was that it showed that they cared about their money more than they cared about their children. Moshe Rabbeinu got upset at them because the ikar reason why you're going into Eretz Yisrael is for the children. It's for Klal Yisrael, not for the animals. Yes, it's true that you have animals, and yes, Yiddish geld is something that's chashuv and should be something that's chaviv by you, but it's not the ikar, because you have to keep the ikar, and you have to keep the tafel. That's the lashon of Rashi. So when they're trying to show Moshe Rabbeinu that they recognize the mistake that they made, so first they said, we're going to take care of the children, and then we're going to take care of the mikna. Then we're going to take care of the animals. Rashi in Pasuk Tezayin says that they mentioned first they're concerned about the mikna, and then they're concerned about the children. And Moshe says that that's the wrong order. First they have to be worried about the children, then you have to be worried about the animals. So when they were made the alta usam, shahidu alta usam, hiskiru b'resh devrayim, sheikar mashem be'emes yitzak usalataf yachakach l'makna. That when they were being made to Moshe Rabbeinu, that they understood the mistake, they were trying to correct their mistake. So then they said the children first and then the mikna. If they didn't mention the nashim, because that wasn't the focus of what they were talking about over here, which may be a separate question. We find in Sefer Bereshis, on the pasuk of Vayokom Yaakov Yisas Bono Vesnoshav Alagmalim, it says that Yaakov took his children and his wives and went on the camels. And Rashi says, of their hiktim schorm l'nekevis, the Esav hiktim nekevis l'schorm. Yaakov first mentioned the males and then the females, and Esav first mentioned the females and then he mentioned the schorm. Shenema, because the pasuk says later, Vayikach Esav esnoshav esbanav. That Esav first takes his wives and then he takes his children. So it's muchach from here that we see that the derech of tzaddikim is to be maktiv the schorm. And this is a geil halacha, which we'll see later in the Mishnah and Harvius. So why is it that Moshe and Yeshua says the Noshim first and then the Taf? Taf l'chayra includes Charim also. And also another aura that is welcome to ask over here, that Yeshua changed the Lashon HaPasuk from what Moshe Rabbeinu said. Because Moshe Rabbeinu first said Nשיכם, Tefchem, ומקניכם, but by Yeshua there's no Vav over here. By Tefchem. It says Nשיכם, Tefchem, ומקניכם. So, l'chayra it's another pashut that a person has to first be concerned with the schorim and then the nekevis. That's why by Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, when they were talking about themselves, they said tapenu, neshenu, miknenu. First the children, because those are the schorim, and then the nashim. When Moshe Rabbeinu and Yeshua, when they were talking to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, when they were talking about them, they first mentioned the chiyuv, that they have to leave the nashim over in Evar Yarden, and then the children. So first they mention the nashim because the teva of a person is that it's much more difficult for him to part with his wife than it is to part from his children. That's why Moshe and Yeshua mentioned first the inyan of separating from their wives, so they're going to go to war, and then they're going to separate from their children. Why? Because they wanted to, Moshe and Yeshua were both great leaders of Klal Yisrael, and they wanted to be mishtatef in the tzara, and they wanted to tell them that we understand what you're going through, and that's why they said that you have to leave meaning that you don't have a choice, but to leave the children and the wives on the other side. But because of the preda of it, the difficulty of the preda, because it's so much more difficult to separate from your wife, to go to war than from your children. So that's why they mentioned it in that order. Meaning, even though be'etzem ikar hadin, the right thing to do is to mention the males first, the schorm, and then the kevis. But that's when each person is by himself. But over here, Moshe and Yeshua were trying to be mishtatif in the tsar of Klal Yisrael. And we know from the Gemara Ksubas in Shasant that there were stories with Amirim that they didn't, that they left their wives on their own and they got punished for it. So there's a big inyan to make sure that a person takes care of his wife properly and doesn't leave her to sit around. Just an interesting story about Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, that he was a masmid otzim, that he would learn about 18 hours a day, and his wife would spend most of her time at home, alone by herself. And he felt bad, so he would learn, so every day he would learn Chumash with her for an hour. To do that, he would learn Chumash with his wife. But at one point, maybe she said something to him that she was lonely, so he split the hour in half, that he would learn with her for a half hour in the afternoon and a half hour at night, just to be able to spend more time with her. It wasn't more time; it was the same exact amount of time, but it was twice. He was showing that he cared about her even more. Now, Avada, it's over there in the Gemara. The Gemara Ksubas is talking about stories when the Amira went to learn and they left their wives at home to tend to the families. But Avada, things are different. B'chlal, this halachis and hashkaf, proper hashkaf, they have to know when Klal Yisrael is fighting a war, Klal Yisrael is fighting a milchama. And we also find that Moshe Rabbeinu was Moisef in that pasuk in Sefer in Parshas Dvarim. He says, "Yodati ki mikne rav lechem yeshu ba'areichem." And the Netziv writes that Moshe Rabbeinu said this to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven to show them that he understands the difficulty to leave their wives alone. He says, "Yodati ki mikne rav lechem." But the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was matigish this Indian that of the Nashim and the Taf, that Moshe Rabbeinu was talking. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to just say, "Okay, fine, just go do what you have to do." He didn't want to, he wanted to make a point of mentioning it to show that he cares. He didn't want to be mavliya. He didn't want to swallow it up. The Netziv says that it just sounded like he didn't care. A lot of times people say the right things and even say the right words in the right time and everything. But they don't put enough of a dagesh on that specific nekuda. So Moshe Rabbeinu was putting the dagesh on that specific nekuda of being mishtatif b'tzarasim, that the wives aren't going to be there. And Stamasa, it's interesting. L'mashal, we find that when they wanted to appoint Elazar ben Azariah to be the Nasi, he said he has to go ask his wife. And the reason is because he was 18 years old, according to most, and we know the Mishnah ben Shmoneser l'chuppah was probably married for not that long, and maybe he was in Shana Rishaynos. He couldn't just go hang out by the best dinner to be the Nasi Israel at that time. He had to ask rishus from his wife if he's going to be a Nasi, and especially since the Gemara says they wanted somebody that's going to have a shaykhus to the government and be able to influence the government. It's going to be difficult for a young woman and a new wife to be able to run a house, to sit alone in the house by herself, and she needs a husband to take care of her, or at least to spend time with her. So that's why Moshe was Moisef Avav when he says Vit Tapchem. He says Neshechem Vit Tapchem Umekneichem, because he wanted to make the story a little bit longer, because he wants to mention the Nina the Taf to be madgish that it's not a pasha dezach to leave the children there either. And it's not only that, but you're leaving the wives and the children, and there's going to be minimal support from the husband. It's going to be very nakashmak. So that's why he says Neshechem Vit Tapchem, adding in this Ois Vav, like it's something else, meaning that there's the wife part, and then there's also the children part. It's not one thing, because the difficulty of being without a wife is different than the difficulty of leaving your children elsewhere. And Moshe Rabbeinu had to say it like this because he was the one that made up this idea. He was the one that made the Tanai with them that you can't just go into Eretz Yisrael. So he can't just say, "Okay, go," and you'll leave your wives there and whatever. But you'll have to be able to, Moshe made this halacha for Bnei Gad and Reuven, so he has to make sure that the wives and the children are taken care of. But Yeshua is not coming to be mechadish this. Yeshua is just coming to reinforce what Moshe Rabbeinu said. and they're already all prepared for this. So he doesn't need to give them the pep talk for this, that, you're not going to be with your wives and everything like that, because Moshe Rabbeinu already did that. So he just came to masker this Indian for them, and he doesn't need to be married. So he just says, Nשיכם, טפכם, ומקניכם. Now, we mentioned before that the Mishnah in Hari. So what they turn? Mishnah in Hari says in Laf Yud Gimel, Va'ish koydem leisha lahachyos ulahashav aveda. That a man comes before a woman, lahachyos, to, maybe it means to save their life, and to return an aveda. V'ha'isha koydemis leish l'ksus ulahoitzi mi beis hashvi b'zman ulahoitzi mi beis hashvi. A woman comes before a man for clothing, because for her to not walk around with clothing, she won't. It's tremendously embarrassing. And to take her out from a Beis HaShevi, when she's taken captive, the mitzvah is to redeem the women first, because there's much more that they can get hurt by be held captive than the men. Let's say, unfortunately, there are men and women that are being held captive. Then you have to get the male out of there first. The reason for that is, Rashi says, because there's a chash of mishkav schor over there, and we want to stay away from, if the men are being held captive, there's a chash from mishkav schor also, so that's, we have to stay away from that to an extent also. Maybe it's mashma from here that mishkav schor is mocham the regular snus, or the onus that the shvi is going to go through. But we know that Eretz Canaan was shtufei zima, and they had to be extra special careful in there about this. Okay, and now there's a separate shaila that's not really negay here. It just came to mind a little bit because we're discussing this. But the idea is that the Mishnah says that in the Ksubis, if a person marries a woman from Eretz Yisrael, or marries a woman in Chutz La'aretz and divorces her in Eretz Yisrael, or gets married for a woman to Eretz Yisrael, or marries a woman from Eretz Yisrael and divorces her in Chutz La'aretz, so how do you deal with the mammonis of it? It's not really negay l'ninena, but it just came to mind dealing about differences between men and women. I want to go back to what we mentioned from Rashi in Parshas Vayetze about Yaakov and Esav. So Rashi says that Yaakov mentions the women first and then the children. Mentions the children first and then the women. Esav mentions the women first and then the children. Why is that? So the Maral mentions that the idea is, the concept is that Yaakov married his wives kedei that he should have 12 shvatim. That's why they're the ikr. That's why they're the main part of the family. The children, not the wives. Masha'inkin by Esav, the ikr is by Esav, he had children because he was trying to be Mamali's taiva with women. And Mamela, he had children that were born. So by Esav, the ikr is his wives, not the ikr is his children. I'm just going to read the Lashon of the Maral because I just see it inside. The reason, because by Esav, his wives were ikr, but Yaakov, the concept was that they're an emtsoi, that they're a way to get to the goal. They're a means to a goal. By Esav, it wasn't a means to the goal. The goal was to be Isaac and Tivus with women, because Esav married them l'shemus nos. So therefore, what's his main idea? His main idea is nashim. So Mamela, when Esav is dealing with nashim and children, he's going to mention the nashim first, because that's ikr by him. The nashim haya ikr daita, because the nashim are ikr by him. The reason why he has children is because he's being Isaac and Tivus with the women. But Yaakov didn't marry his wives, obviously not for taiva, but to be mekayim, to be man with 12 shvatim, like Rashi says in Bereshis in Parak Chav Tes Pasuk Chav Aleph, and his children were gerim, meaning he had to have children from somewhere. Where did he get the children from? He didn't go to the store and buy them. He had to get married, and he had to have the children. Meaning his goal was Yaakov's goal. Yaakov's idea, the tafkid of Yaakov Avinu was to bring the 12 shvatim into the world. How did he do that? With his wives and his children. Because he had to bring these children into the world, he had to get married in order that they should be, meaning the wives were the way he was going to be able to get to the children. And it says in Rashi that when Rachel didn't have children, so Rachel was chayshish that maybe Yaakov is going to divorce her because she doesn't have children. we don't find that by Sarah, we don't find that by Rivka. So why is Rachel chayshish that Yaakov would divorce her, right? So the pshat is that being that the whole concept of Yaakov Avinu is to be able to have children, and he's not going to stay married if he can't have children. So Mamela, then there was a chash to get to, then maybe there was makom to say that he would divorce her, because Yaakov was able to have children from his other wives. And because we don't find anywhere, let's say that Elkanah thought about divorcing Chana because she didn't have children. But the concept of the Nashim, the concept of the Isha by Yaakov was very different, because the whole Siba of him getting married was Ach v'rak lahilat banim, or just to have children. I mean, now there's no Siba for him to have children over here, so then he doesn't need the Imsai to get to that. But by Esav, the concept is that the wives were the main part, and they're the Siba for the children. Now, Zok the Moral weiter, the children of Yaakov Avinu was something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu very, very much wanted. It was chayfetz behem before they were even created, like the Medrash says. That he took Me'avnei Amokim from the place of the Beis HaMikdash where he was sleeping, or where he was trying to sleep. Rabbi Yehuda says he took 12 stones, and he says this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was geyser, that he should be Ma'amid Yud Beis Shvatim. Omar Yaakov said Avram lehemidam. Avram didn't establish 12 Shvatim. Kevan shenesachu Yud Beis Avanim zuluzu yoda shu Ma'amid Yud Beis Shvatim. Once he saw that all these 12 stones became one, then he knew that he's going to be Ma'amid 12 Shvatim. I mean, it wasn't, over here it's interesting, over here it sounds like the pshat is that there were 12, not one. So it's Mavur, from here we see that Hashem Yisbarach was chofetz to have the Shvatim even before they were born. And we find weiter in Parshas Peshalach that they came to a place that they had Shtei Mesrei Einois Mayim, there were 12 springs of water that were connected to 12 Shvatim. And the Gerardia brings from the Mechilta that these Mayanos, these springs of water, were there from Sheshes Simei Bereshis, which Eichel Sheshes Simei Bereshis to the 12 Einois Mayim. But the concept is that the Shvatim were Kilu Olav B'Machshava, Bereshis, B'Shvil Yisrael, Shenik Bereshis, this is the creation. The whole Sefer Bereshis is the Sefer Avos. The concept, the idea of Sefer Avos is to bring out this point that Rashi brings at the beginning of Sefer Bereshis, is B'Shvil Yisrael, Shenik Bereshis. Yisrael meaning Yaakov Avinu and the Shvatim. That the Tachlis Habriya is Yaakov Avinu and the Shvatim. Yaakov Avinu's wives was an emtzoi to get to the Shvatim, but the Iker is the Shvatim. Mamela, that's why he has, when they came to that place, they had 12 Einois Mayim, and they were there from Sheshes Simei Bereshis, because that was the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was chofetz, and these used Beis Shvatim even before they were born. And the Medrash also says in a few places that Kishem She'en HaShamayim Yecholim Lamoy Chutz Miyud Beis Mazalis. The same way it's not shaykh for the Shemayim to exist without Yud Beis Mazalis, that 12 constellations, so too Ein Ha'olam Yachal Lamed Chutz Miyud Beis Shvatim, so too the world cannot exist without the 12 Shvatim. And Avad HaKadosh Baruch Hu is chafetz b'kiyum ha'olam. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu is chafetz b'kiyum ha'olam, then you need to have the Shvatim, because the Shvatim are tonight b'kiyum ha'olam. And the Shvatim is what caused Yaakov to marry his wife, that these children should be born from these women. And the Maharal elsewhere says in the story with Rachel giving over the Simonim, what was going on over there. So Rachel knew that Yaakov should really only have one wife. And if that were to be true, then that would mean that all 12 children would have to be born from that wife, because Yaakov is also to have Yud Beis children, to have Yud Beis Shvatim. And but even in the creation of Klal Yisrael, that Klal Yisrael be'etzem should be echad, but it's not shaykh that there should be a complete achdus and complete shleimus of the ganzkeit of Klal Yisrael in this world. So therefore, l'kach kibla Rachel davar zeh be'ava, sheyisa Yaakov games Leah, she'ein Yaakov roi sheyeh le'isha achas b'lfad. That's not really appropriate, it's not really right, that all the, meaning that the achdus of Klal Yisrael would be so much greater if all the 12 Shvatim would have been born through one woman. Well, the Maisa wasn't like that, and that was what was going on between Rachel and Leah. Now, there's a lot to talk about the differences between Rachel and Leah, but Be'etzem, it also boils down to the Rachel and Leah story, saga, also boils down to the chiluk between Yosef and Yehuda, which we spoke about many times, and from Rabbi Seinu, Befrat Imre Emes talks about this barichas throughout Sefer Bereshis, from the throughout all the parashiyos, but the Achdus of Klal Yisrael would have been complete in a sense if they would have all been born from one woman, and it's so because it wasn't right that all the Klal Yisrael should have been born from one woman. So then, Kibla Rachel Dover Zebi Abba Sheyisi Yaakov Games Leah Shein Yaakov Roi Sheyilo Isha Achas V'Vat. It's not right for Yaakov; they should be married to only one. So we see from here that the concept of having 12 Shvatim is what causes Yaakov to be married to Rachel and to be married to Leah and the Shvachas as well. Mela, it's Roi L'Fikach Roi L'Hakdim Abban V'Achikach Hanoshim by Yaakov Avinu, but by Esav, because his whole concept of marrying women was because he married women, he had children from them. So then his ikar focus was Noshim. And if he had children, he didn't have children, we are not concerned about the Hemshech of Esav. Definitely not nearly as much as we're concerned about the Hemshech told us Yaakov. By Moshe Rabbeinu in Parsha Shmos it says, Vayirkav Ishtoi u'banov ala chamor. It says Ishtoi first and then it says Banov. Why? Because over there his children were little. His children were small. How do you know his children were small? Because Moshe was 77 when he married Sipora, like a Shteit in Yalkut. And he was 80 years old. That was 3 years before he stood in front of Paro in Eretz Mitzrayim. So his children were born within those 3 years. So his children couldn't have been any older than really 2, because he married Sipora, let's say 9 months later his first child was born. So he was 77. So then, let's say 77, or he was 78 when his child was born, and then he was standing in front of Paro and he was 80. And the children were tzrichin le'iman. They needed their mother. They couldn't just go. So they were very young. So it's not. So the proper way to describe it, when the Torah tells us that Moshe vayirkav ishtoi u'banav ala chamor, the ikar over here is ishtoi because the children were very little. Described into sand, because compared to Yaakov and compared to Yaakov and the Yimahos, we don't talk about that in the same regard when we talk about Sipora and the children of Moshe, who didn't Yarshin him because it went to Yeshua ben Nun. But therefore, that's why it wasn't shy for them to travel without their mother. Memela, the pasuk says the Ishtoi Tchila, the wife first. But what about when it says in Parshas Vayishlach, it says Vayikach Yaakov es Noshav v'Sachar oso Yoladav. So maybe they want to tell me that Moshe Rabbeinu said Yaakov Avinu Echar, but now we have another pasuk that says Vayakov Avinu Vayikach Yaakov es Noshav, the women first, and then his 11 children, because Binyamin wasn't born yet. So the Ramban writes that when it comes to the mitzvah of Hatzalah, then of saving people, you got to save everybody. And there's no specific order. We're not going to say to save this one, save that one, save the other one. You'll ask me from the Mishnah at the end of Hariyas, who's first to Hatzalah? It's not fair. Why? Because the Torah is telling you how he crossed them over this little river, this brook over there that he had. And the derech is, as a general rule, the derech is you take the easier things first, and then you take the things that are harder. So the nashim, they're able to cross over first, and then the children go afterwards. But the Maral says that this chiluk is only true when you're taking the children to a place where they're going to be settled. Because the Isha is Isha v'olam, like the Gemara says in Yavamis of Samach Beis, Hashar b'lo Isha, Shar b'lo Tova b'lo Bracha. And the Gemara says in Megillah and Tavchav Zayin that you don't sell a Sefer Torah. The only time you would sell a Sefer Torah is to learn Torah or to get married. And the Gemara asks to get married, what's happens? So the Gemara brings the pasuk l'soy b'rel Shabbos Yitzara, because a person who gets married, Hanoisa Isha, is being mashlim himself. He's creating a shlemus. Till now he was half a mensch, now he's a whole mensch. Mela, this is a asik in Yeshua Shalayla. So that's the pshat in why in creating Yeshua Shalaylam, you have to bring the women first. There's Ramban in the Malchamas in Yavamas that says that this din is true. Afilu im noise isha she love basbonim. Meaning, even if a person marries a woman and he's not going to be able to have children from her, the concept of the isha being miyashav the olam, the person being mashlam himself and being Isaac being Yeshua Shalaylam, is even if he's not going to be able to have children from her. The Atom concept of Nesuin is a gather of Yeshua Shalaylam, because it helps a person settle down and gives them Yeshua Das. And children along those lines are also Yeshua Shalaylam, not just in the sense that you're populating the world, but you're creating worlds. You're creating Olamais. You're creating a hemshech for yourself, and you're creating Olamais. You're creating a hemshech of your Yeshua Olam. Now by Yaakov, we said that the Torah says the children first because they're the Iker. And by Esav, we say that the Nashim are first because by Esav, the Nashim are Iker. But when we're, and that's when we're talking about the Iker. But when we're talking about Stam just crossing a river for safety purposes, that's not Iker. We're not talking about Yeshua Shalaylam. So then there's no welcome to say, how exactly, of course, it doesn't really matter. Meaning it's not in every sense that the Nashim have to come before that the Bun will come before the Nashim. It's only because Nashim are Yeshua Shalaylam. And by Yaakov Avinu, the Iker Yeshua Olam over there was to create the 12 Shvatim. Memela, that's why by Yaakov, when we're talking about Yeshua Shalaylam, the Shvatim come first and then the Nashim. But if not, then we could even mention the Nashim first. Mela, getting back to our Shemuz about Bnei Gad and Reuven, so when they say Mikneh and Taf before the Nashim, so it's mashma that they're trying to be miyashav the olam like Esav is, meaning that their focus is the Nashim. Meaning they don't want Eretz Yisrael because they want to fight, because Esav is Yideish, Tzaidish, Sad, and Yaakov is Ishtam Yeshev Eolam, because all Yaakov wants is Yeshua Shalaylam. Why are you fighting Eretz Yisrael? You're fighting for Eretz Yisrael because you want to fight, or because you want Eretz Yisrael. If you're fighting, then you have to fight Yeshua Shal Eretz Yisrael. The concept of fighting for Yeshua Shal Eretz Yisrael is the idea that you're doing this to be Mekayim the Ratzon Hashem. The Ratzon Hashem is that there should be a Yeshua Shalaylam. And because it is, that's the reason why Yeshua was marked in the Nashim. Because the Nashim are the Ikri Yeshua Shalaylam. Even for Shevet God. That, that the Ikri reason why Shevet God is going here is so that he should be able to fight. Now, if we're saying that the idea is, we were talking about Yeshua Shalaylam, so my Indian fighting over here, right? So the pshat is like this. We spoke before in the previous year that God was an extremely powerful warrior, and he would kill people in a very powerful way. And the concept is he would say, oh, he's doing this just to fight, right? But the Zach is he's not doing it just to fight, because if he's doing it just to fight, then he wouldn't be busy trying to be Miyashav Eretz Yisrael. He wouldn't be busy trying to be Miyashav his Shevet in Ev HaYarden. He wouldn't be looking for the Yeshuv HaOlam. He'd be looking for Milchama to continue fighting. And he wanted to be Manchel, a certain Kedusha, to his Shevet, and that's the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu gave them of Baruch Mark of God, Torah Zroya Avkodka, like we spoke earlier. Now, this is a very Zaytik Ha'ar, but it was just something that came up because of the discussion of who comes first, the Nashim or the Banim. So in the Anenus, in the Siddur that we say by Slichas, some Siddurim have it, Anenu Ezras Hashvatim Anenu, Anenu Miskavi Mois Anenu, and there are other Siddurim, other Machzarim, that say Anenu Miskavi Mois Anenu, Anenu Ezras Hashvatim Anenu. And this is something that bothered me for a very long time. I finally looked into it. The Adaris writes like this, that the right order is Anenu Miskavi Mois Anenu, Anenu Ezras Hashvatim Anenu. The Shaila is, are we doing this in chronological order? Is that what matters to us? Or the pshat is that there's a specific reason why it has to be in the Seder? So it can be what we just explained from the Maral, that the pshat is that by Yaakov Avinu, the Iker was the Yeshua Shalaylam. So then, Avad, the Shvatim come first. And then you could say Miskavi Mois even afterwards. But in the Siddur of Tfilah L'Moshe, brings from Reb Chaim Kanievsky, that Miskavi Mois means Sheshama Hashem es Tfilosim Upoktam, that Hashem listened to the Tfilos of the Mois and gave them children. Because Miskav is a lashon of Miskav L'Itais Batzara, like the Pasuk says in Tilim, which is a hechekite that's Meira on the Shinui HaTeva. And that was the teva of the Imois, was that they wouldn't be able to have children. And so that's a pshat in Miskav Imois. Now, if the Imois couldn't have children, then where would the Shvatim come from? So it goes back to that thought that the Maral says that it would have been that Yaakov would have had all the Shvatim from one wife. And there is makom to say that this is a makom yun. Another part that Yitzchak talks about in a place, but there's a makom yun over here. I don't mean makom yun as a question, but like something that we have to get back to, something that we have to think about. That there was a specific bris with the Imois as well. Like there's a bris of Ovis, and there's a bris of the Shvatim, and a bris with Klal Yisrael, but there's a bris with the Imois also. And as I state be'etzem in Teres Kehanim in Parashas Bechuk Kaisai. And the Slichas at Sem Gedalia, we say bris of Ovis for Imois. We say it, it's in the Slichas, it's in the Machzor, we say it. So that's the Iker, HaMecholas HaOretz, the Iker, Yishuv of Eretz Yisrael, was for the Shvatim. And there was a special bris, there's a specific bris that had to be, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was giving for the Shvatim, that they should have Nachal for Eretz Yisrael. Okay, now, I want to talk about a few ha'aras. I think we're done with the big shtiklach for tonight. I think we're going to go through just a couple more quick ha'aras. We'll get back to some stuff next time. The Gemara Ksubas famously says, Gemara Shabbos, Gemara elsewhere on Daf Tes, that Kalayotzel Melchemes Beis David get krisus kaisei lishtoi. Anybody that would go out to fight a war in Melchemes Beis David, so he would give his wife a get al tnai, that if he doesn't make it in the war, so then she does. If there's a tzad to fall to Yibum, she won't fall to Yibum. And when he comes, if he would come back, so then he would, they would get rid of this get in a way. Or it was al tonight that if something would happen, so then it was a good krisus case. So it's a big sugi there in Ksubas and Daf Tes and Gemara Shabbos, big types, and over there, there's a lot to learn. So the shaila is Vasas Gishen by Melchemes Yeshua. What happened by the Melchama of Yeshua? Is there any mokum to say that they made a get krisus? So that l'chayra, it sounds like from this Gemara that there's something specific about Melchemes Beis David, right? Now we know that David fought against Amalek, David fought against many different nations, but David also expanded and was kaidish other areas that were not part of the Etzem Kibush of Eretz Yisrael. And we spoke about that in earlier shiurim, that there was Gevissa, Aram Narayim, and Aram Tzova, that those were places that David HaMelech conquered that were not part of Eretz Yisrael Lechatchila. So if you want to tiny that the pshat is that was Melchemes Beis David, Cheres I'm to say that it's going on that. But the Baal HaTurim in Parashas Matos says, Lamed Beis Chof Aleph, the Baal HaTurim says, V'ovar lechem kol cholutz es hayarden l'fnei Hashem, and all the soldiers will go cross over the Yarden l'fnei Hashem ad hirishu es evav mipana, until they'll run all their enemies out of town. And it says cholutz beis b'mesorah. There's 2 times in the Tanakh that it says cholutz. V'ovar lechem kol cholutz, and cholutz hanal by yibum. That's what he says in the Gemara Shabbos, that Kol Yetzel Melchemes Beis David get krisus kaisei l'ishtoi. Why? Said there shouldn't be a case of Yibum, and you shouldn't have to do Chalitza, so you give a get to pata from this whole business. So you see from here, Zok the Baal HaTurim, Shegam Moshe Asa Keinu Mimenu Lomad David. The Moshe Rabbeinu also did this, and that's where David HaMelech got it from. And that's the pshat V'ovar lechem kol cholutz, meaning chalutz hanal, to pata you from Chalitza. Now, Rashi says in Ksubas that the one who came up with this idea was Yishai Avi David. We hear the Baal HaTurim saying that Moshe did it. I want to get back to this because there's a lot to talk over here, but the main kash is like this. Problem is with the Baal HaTurim is that you have a Gemara Kedusha and Daf Gimel that says the Misas Habal Mater. We know that there's 2 ways that an Isha is Yetzim Mebaila, right? Either Bigat or Misa Sabal. So Misa Sabal is matter from the pasuk Pen Yamas B'Mulchama V'Shachri Kuchen. The pasuk that we learned out that Misa Sabal is matter is from the pasuk that says that maybe the husband will die in the war and then another man will take his wife. So we see. So that's where Misa Sabal comes from. That Misa that if the Baal dies and someone else can marry her. Well, the from the Baal HaTurim sounds like he's saying that that the reason why it won't fall to Yibam is because he's giving a get. But the Gemara is using this idea to tell you that there's a Misa Sabal. So Chayra, there's no Malcolm for a get over here. So meaning that you can't say that the Ikar Limit is from this pasuk. So the Achrayim does elaborate on this. And one of the truths maybe is that if the whole concept of Kol Yetzel and Mechames Beis David get Krisis Kaiser Lishta is only going to be a case where it's Shaykh Yibam. If it's not Shaykh Yibam, then it doesn't matter. So maybe that's what we're talking about over here. But there's a lot to talk, and maybe we'll get back to it next time and to explain a little more. Okay, that's our number one. Our number two. The Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Malachim. Now, from now till the end of the parak, we're going to end up bumping into and discussing a lot of ideas from the Rambam and Hilchos Malachim throughout. Many concepts of Yeshua ben Nun and the Milchamas that Klal Yisrael is fighting from the Milchamas Kibush Eretz Yisrael. So Rambam starts with Hilchos Malachim, Parak Aleph, Halacha Aleph, Shalosh Mitzvahs and Stavi Yisrael, B'Shas Knisas and La'aretz. There are 3 mitzvahs that Klal Yisrael was commanded to do when they came into Eretz Yisrael. Number 1, Limnos Lehem Melech, to appoint to them a king, Shenamar Samtasam Lechem Melech. That's number 1. And number 2 is Lahachar Zar Shal Amalek, to destroy the descendants of Amalek, Shenamar Timcha Zech Amalek. Number 3 is V'Livnes Beis Abchir, to build the Beis Hamikdash, Shenamar L'Shich Nesidushu Uvasa Shama. We know this is a Braisa and Sanhedrin of Chafam and Beis Ayin Sham. So Shaila is like this. Why did the Braisa only talk about Lahachar Zar Shal Amalek and not say anything about the mitzvah of destroying the 7 nations that live in Eretz Yisrael? So if you look at the Rambam at the beginning of Perek Hey in Hilchos Malachim, he says, "Ein HaMelech nilcham tchila ela milchemes mitzvah." That the first war that a new melech can fight, or any melech can fight, is a milchemes mitzvah. Meaning that if there are a bunch of options to battle, the one that he has to take care of first is the milchemes mitzvah, and anything after that he could do after that. But first, the mitzvah is priority. Be'ezei milchemes mitzvah. What's the milchemes mitzvah? Zu milchemes zayin animit. This is the milchama fighting the 7 nations. U milchemes amalek. Be'ezras Yisrael miyatzar shabalan. Or protect, helping, saving Klal Yisrael from an enemy that comes to attack them. V'yachar kach nilcham be'milchemes harishos. And then afterwards, you can fight any milchemes harishos. V'yal milchama shenilcham imshar amim. You want more land, you want to, drive away other countries, other peoples, you could do that also. Even if it's just for power, even if it's just a power game, the king's allowed to do it also. As I state in the Rambam. Stam, in Mamamar Muzgar, they're very busy with the wars in Eretz Yisrael of today. His pashtus is Ezras Yisrael Miyatzar. We don't have a melech, that's not a question. But the concept of the Mulchama, even without a melech, would be Ezras Yisrael Miyatzar Shabaleh. That part will be a Mulchemes Mitzvah. Now, a Pashtus, you need a melech for a Mulchemes Mitzvah, as Rambam starts off with. But over here we see that the Rambam is kailel the concept of Mulchemes Shiva Umas together with the Mulchemes Amalek. So even though he doesn't say that clearly in the beginning of Hilchos Malachim and Perek Aleph, but upon him, he's sort of meramis to it in the beginning of Perek Hey. And in Vayter Perek Aleph and Halacha Beis, he says, Milchemes Mitzvah ain't tzarich little barushos Bezdin. Milchemes Mitzvah, you don't need to go through Bezdin. Elayetza me'atzma b'choleis. He's able to go out whenever he wants to fight this war at any time. V'kaifa amlatzes, you can make a draft and force people to join the war. Avol b'milchemes harishos ain't emartzi amba. But for Milchemes harishos, he's not allowed to make any drafts. LLP Bezdin Shashim Vechad, only if he gets a haskama from Bezdin Shashim Vechad. So we see clear in the Rambam and Perek Hey that the mitzvah of Milchama with the Zaynumis is nichlal together with the Milchama and the Hachrazah Zara Shal Amalek. And the Kesef Mishnah says, he brings a Gemara at the end of Saitam and Dalatim and Peis. When do we say that there are people that are Chayzer Me'orchei Milchama Oisam Sheiske B'Milchemes Harishus? Those are the people that we mentioned by Milchemes Harishus. Aval B'Milchemes Mitzvah. When it comes to Milchemes Mitzvah, everybody goes out. Even a newly married man, and a newly married woman, they also have to take part in the war. On Rabbi Yehuda, what are we talking about? That you're Chayzer Lach Me'arach Al Milchama That's by Milchemes Mitzvah, like we just said. Avol Milchemes Choiva Hakol Yoytza Nefilu Chosa Mechedrei V'Kala Mechupasa. But when it comes to Milchemes Choiva, then everybody has to go out. Afilu Chosa Mechedrei, Afilu Kala Mechupasa. And the Gemara says, Amarav Milchemes Yeshua L'Kavesh Divrei Lichbaish Divrei Hakol Choiva. What's the Milchemes Choiva? The Milchem of Yeshua. And Milchemes Beis David is L'Ravcha Divrei Hakol Rishus. This that David HaMelech was, just L'Hagdil Shaimai B'Gdulas HaVishamai, like the Rambam says. So that's the Rishus. So what's the machlekes in the Gemara? Completely lemute akum d'leilei layu, to get rid of the nations around them that they don't disturb them. So mar karle mitzvah, mar karle rishus. That's machlekes if it falls under the category of mitzvahs or milchemes mitzvah, or it falls under the category of milchemes or rishus. Now it's understand, because technically speaking, the Gemara says that the milchemes Yeshua is called the milchemes chayva, and the Rambam refers to it as the milchemes mitzvah. So now it's Kedai to go through that sugi over there in the Gemara in Soito. So the question is that the pasuk says that we're talking about here in Nashim Tafchem, the Neshechem Tafchem and Meknechem, that they're going to go to Eva Yarden. Now, if this is a Milchemes Choiva or Milchemes Mitzvah, there's a strong tzad to say the Nashim are mechuyev in the war. Now, the Pashtus, I think this is what we have to say. I think that the Pashtus is that the Nashim of, meaning if we're saying that the Nashim of the Shara Shvatim are going to be Leichem the Milchamas in Eretz Yisrael, so it's Tafka the Shara Shvatim, but the Neshei God of Ruvain, they stay, as the pasuk says now, the Neshechem Tafchem Meknechem, they're going to stay in Efa Yarden. They're not going to come into the Yarden. Okay, Shilas Rashash says if they're in Saita, what do the women do exactly? We have a Nochi Gemara that in Nazir Dafnun Tes. There's a problem for women to fight a war, to be part of combat. Talmud Lemah, the pasuk says, that a woman is not allowed to wear a man's clothing. It's referring to, the Gemara says, referring to armor, it's referring to weapons. And that's very interesting because the Targum Yonasan says by L'yiyah kli gever al isha, it's referring to tefillin. So the Gemara says that somebody who's sach ben tefillin l'tefillin is chayzel v'archa melchama. And Maral explains, and others explain also, because when a person puts on tefillin, he's creating the Shem Hashem. So he's being mapsik between the Shem Hashem, and he's chayzel v'archa melchama. Hashem is not going to protect him, because you need that Shem Hashem that's going to protect you during the war. Okay, that's that. So it's a shayla. What's the difference between Milchemes Mitzvah and Milchemes Chayva? But the Gemara says clearly that the Milchem of Yeshua is the Milchemes, at the strongest is Milchemes Chayva. So there'd be three levels of Milchama. There's Milchemes Chayva, and then there's Milchemes Mitzvah, and then there's Milchemes Rishus. And the Rambam speaks this out, and the Rambam goes through this. One more Ha'ara, really two more. Is there any makom to say that the children had epis to do with fighting in the war? Maybe al chinuch, but the pashtus is that the let's back it up a little bit. The Bnei Sasson Derech Edesecha says the following. He's also oimed on the Ha'ara that the Neshechem Tafchem is missing a Vav Hashimush, and Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was talking to them, he used the Vav Hashimush. He says Rak Neshechem Vit Tafchem Umeknechem Yadati Kimik Rablechem. He says it's not a mikra, it's coming to teach us something. So what's it coming to teach? So he says, Afilu oisei hataf, even those children, she'ene karach acharaim. Meaning, we know from the Gemara Sukkah, from the Mishnah Sukkah really, that there are children that they're tzarech l'imam and children that are not tzarech l'imam. Meaning, the Gemara says that if they wake up in the middle of the night and they don't go crying to mommy, so then if they don't cry to mommy, then they're higil l'chinuch, and if they cry to mommy, that means that they're still small, they're still young, and they're not higil l'chinuch. Is there any makom to say that they should be part of the Milchama here b'chlal? So it's like the Bnei Sasson, that even those children that are not karach achar imo, so then they're part of Tafchem that are going to go to Evar Yarden. Because if it's a Vit Tafchem with a Vav Achibur, so it would show that I might think that Dafka, the top that are Mechubra Limoiseyam, is what we're talking about, but the ones that are not Mechubra Limoiseyam, meaning the ones that are Tzrichel Imam, then they would, the ones that are not Tzrichel Imam, then they would have to go fight the war. But we know from the Psukim in Parshas Bamidbar and Sefer Bamidbar that it's only mi ben esrim shana v'mala kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael. Why? So the pasuk says at the beginning of Parshas Bamidbar, Parak Aleph, pasuk Gimel, mi ben esrim shana v'mala kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael. Rashi says that Magid chen yotzei tzava pachs mi ben esrim shana. There's no such thing as somebody that goes to war that's under 20 years old. So there's no time to say that Tafchem are going to fight a war according to this. Ramban explains over there that till a person's 20 years old, he's not old enough to stand b'kishrei ha-milchama, like the Mishnah says in Avis, and the end of Parak Hey, ben esrim l'rdaif, at 20, he's able to be roidev. Roidev what? So that's a big question. But the Ramban goes right and he says, Al yitachna she'iyah pirish kol yotzei tzava kol yotzei lihikahel be'eda kenar lihikahel b'steicha am. Talking about the Tiktanim are not really part of the Am. The Kol Yotzei Tzava B'Yisrael doesn't necessarily mean those that go to the army, but those that are part of the Kahal, those that are members of the Kehillah, those that are members of the Eda. Because any kind of gathering of the Am is called a Tzava. And l'chara, that is the Kayach of a Tzibur, that even if somebody who he himself is not so stark in L'chama, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is ready Mafteach Yeshua over here, Chazak V'amatz, and all these people that are going to fight this war, they're going to be Matzliach. So then, but it's just interesting because it wouldn't work out if you follow with the Mishnah exactly, because the Mishnah says Mishmar Esrei L'chuppah, and then it says Ben Esrim L'rdaif. So first you get married and then you get drafted. So in the Milchemes Mitzvah, whatever it was, if we're going with the fact that there were only Ben Esrim Shana V'mayla, so then somebody gets married at 18, he's married for 2 years, and only then he could be drafted into the war. Unless you say that the pshat is that when a melech makes a draft, and it's the Milchemes Chayva, like the Gemara says in Saitas, and it's Afilu Chasa Mechezer Kal Mechupasa, that means that even people under 18 are going to be drafted. Even under 20 are going to get drafted. But Pashtus, they didn't get, I don't know when they got married. Maybe they got married a little older. I don't know. And you have to go through the Sugya in the Gemara Kedushin, Reichaim B'Tzavar, V'Yask B'Tayra. Go through that Sugya, Halan Valahu. Maybe Eretz Yisrael is different than Bavel. Maybe when they were going into Eretz Yisrael, B'Zman Yeshua Benun, there was less of a shidduch crisis or a shidduch / parnasa crisis. But I'll go upon that's on that. Now, it's interesting to say, because we mentioned last time, that the concept of the chinuch that Shevet God gave their children was like the pasuk says, "L'god Omar Baruch Marchiv God Kelabi Shochin Treif Zeroy Af God God." Vayar Reishos like Yisham Chalkas V'Chayk Eksalf and Vayesir Rosh Yom Tzidkas Hashem Os Mishpativ in Yisrael. We explained that was the chinuch that Shevet God gave over. So even though Etzem, they are not mechuyev to go to war until they're 20, but because this is God and God is warriors, so whatever they did, it was with a military, a veteran type of status. And Memela, they were mechanech. Was just spoke last time that they were mechanech. Shevet God was mechanech their children at a very young age to be able to be mishtatev in the Milchemes Yisrael, into the Milchemes Switzerland, into the Milchemes Chayva. We'll stop here and we shall continue Mr. Shem being Masber the rest of the pasuk.